The china chimed first, a fine porcelain ring that carried down the oak table and settled in my bones. Candlelight trembled in the crystal, throwing fractured stars across Heather's champagne flute. My father rose with the comfort of a man who had delivered 1,000 speeches and never once worried about the cost of his words. Silverware quieted, breath tightened, and the familiar scent of roast tenderloin mixed with the colder smell of polished wood. Heather smiled without effort, palm resting on Brian's sleeve, like a seal of completion. I kept my hands folded in my lap, thumbs pressed together to stop a tremor that refused to show itself. Then my father lifted his glass a little higher, and the room leaned toward him like a congregation waiting on a benediction. "To our brilliant daughter," he said, warmth pooling in his voice, "who keeps reminding us what excellence looks like." He paused, eyes sweeping the table and landing on Heather with a shine I had learned to translate, pride for her weather for the rest of us. My mother nodded, already damp, at the corners of her eyes. "You know," he went on, letting a small chuckle shake the rim of his glass, "some kids make you proud. Others just take up space." Brian shifted. The candles hissed. Across the table, Heather looked straight at me and let the corners of her mouth tilt in a knowing, effortless sneer. "Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, down in the comments, and whether you've ever felt reduced to an empty chair at your own family's table. If this moment lands anywhere close to your story, tap the like button so others can find it, and subscribe if you want to hear how I carried this night into a different life. But to understand why that single sentence didn't break me, and why my answer surprised everyone in that room, you need to know how we arrived at this table. I grew up in a quiet Connecticut town where the maples burn the sky each October, and the cul-de-sacs stay trimmed like report cards. Our house sat straight-backed on its lot shutters, painted the color of a school uniform. My father balanced budgets, and if I'm honest, people, my mother taught algebra and believed life is easier when it can be solved. Heather learned those equations by heart. I learned how light behaves against brick, how skin finds its color in shadow, how a sketch can breathe if you leave the right air. When I was 10, Aunt Vivian brought a small wooden box to my birthday, tied with a ribbon that matched the veins of the paper. Inside lay a set of professional watercolors pans, like tiny moons, a brush that fit my hand, as if it had been waiting there all along. I wanted to cry for reasons I couldn't name. My mother smiled and said we could try them after I finished my math homework, but the next year, when Heather won a spelling bee, they drove her to Manhattan for a weekend with ticket shopping and stories I wasn't invited to hear. If you've lived in a house like that, you know it isn't the big things that set the pattern. It's the cheerful that's nice, the requested silence while someone else studies the way your good news is folded into a napkin and cleared from the table without a plate. At 14, my painting hung for a month in the rotunda of the state capitol. My art teacher called our house and spoke for the first time in a voice I recognized, pride like sunlight. That night, the official letter lay by my father's elbow, a neat rectangle, a fact among other facts. "That's nice," he said, then turned his head toward Heather and asked about her debate preparation. The next week, he built her a custom desk in a freshly cleared corner, a soft pool of light designed for thinking. When I asked if we could carve out a small studio space in the basement, he laughed the way people laugh at a child dressed for a costume party on a Tuesday. "When you've got something serious to pursue," he said, "we'll talk. You can love people who make you small if they started loving you first. That's the hardest truth I know." So I tried to fit the shape they offered me. I took advanced science, learned to speak the language of likely and some. I did well enough to make nobody worry and nobody look up. Yet even as I wrote proofs that ended in QED, I kept finding myself in the art room after school, sleeves speckled, heart steady, the smell of turpentine settling me in a way numbers never had. By the time college applications arrived with their glossy promises, the hierarchy was so ordinary we mistook it for gravity. My mother planned Heather's campus visits the way other women plan their daughters' weddings, timeline budget. The shoe that won't blister in Philadelphia. When I asked about art schools, she said the words slowly, as if my ears needed to be persuaded. Just apply somewhere affordable. Art doesn't pay the bills. I chose a state university with a serious studio program and professors who talk about composition like weather systems. Moving into a dorm that smelled like old carpet and possibility, I felt the first winds of a life that might hold me. In college, the air changed. People asked questions that made room for my answers. Professors said, "Stay with that," and meant it. I won scholarships nobody at home could pronounce. When I called to share good news, the sentence always turned a corner. "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Heather made law review?" I stopped expecting a different end. Years passed clean and ordinary. I rented a one-bedroom, carved from a long-dead factory brick walls, holding the day's heat and releasing it at night like a secret. I worked part-time at a small gallery, where Elaine taught me how to frame not just art, but a life. I painted until the city's hum became my heartbeat. I learned the weight of silence and how it can either crush a person or save her. Then my mother texted a sentence that looked like every sentence she ever wrote. Dinner. Saturday at 6. Heather made junior partner. Wear something nice. I bought gas and hope and drove the 55 miles home with my black dress hanging from the hook and my stomach making the small, careful noises of someone who still wants to be surprised. That night, the house was a museum of who we had been taught to be. The runner lay perfectly centered on the polished table. The good silver waited like a performance. My mother's smile was courteous, practiced, and tight. Heather and Brian sat close on the living room sofa, their posture aligned like parallel columns. I stepped into the doorway, and every instinct told me to make myself smaller. Instead, I touched the frame of a family photo, as if to steady the glass, and walked in. I tried something simple. "The gallery sold 3 of my pieces this week," I said to my father as he came from his study, the scent of his aftershave laid carefully across his shirt collar. He nodded a single downbeat. "That's nice," he said. "Bar's set up if you'd like a drink. Any artist will tell you can stretch a canvas only so far before it tears." During dinner, Heather described a motion she filed a judge's eyebrow, a conference room that smelled like new leather and money. My parents asked about names firms and the golf outing scheduled for spring. When Brian mentioned a museum exhibit downtown, my mother turned her head quickly like a bird changing branches. "Speaking of downtown, have you looked at that condo building?" she asked Heather. "The one with the view." The cake arrived with looping chocolate letters that spelled "Congratulations" and nothing else because we already knew whom it was for. I want to be fair. My parents loved us both in the way they knew how. But some people believe affection is a currency earned by achievement, and some children learn to spend their lives trying to qualify. The table held stories like proof of purchase. I ate, quietly sipped water, kept my face where it wouldn't ruin the photos. When my father rose for the toast, I watched his expression shift into the version of himself the town trusted, measured, generous, composed. He lifted his glass and bent the light to his will. "To our brilliant daughter," he said, and I could feel space being assigned. The rest of the room leaned closer, eager to applaud the certainty of excellence. He spoke about first report cards and long nights and grit you can frame. My mother dabbed her eyes and looked at Heather the way a person looks toward the sun in a photograph. Then he let himself laugh the easy sound of a man who never pays the interest on his sentences. "Some kids make you proud," he said. "Others just take up space. If humiliation makes a sound, it's the soft scrape of a chair against a rug when someone wants to disappear and remembers that disappearing would be rude." I didn't move. The air grew heavy, like a storm thinking it over. Brian stared at his plate. My mother pressed her napkin harder than necessary, a small whitening of the knuckles. Aunt Vivian's eyes flicked to mine and held just long enough to say, "I see you." Heather turned her face toward me, not quite a smile. It was the look of someone who has never wondered whether there is a seat with her name on it. In another year, an earlier version of me would have swallowed the room and pretended it was nothing. I would have laughed weakly, said Dad, and let my voice try to carry a peace that never exists in pretending. But I had learned quietly and over time that clarity is a kind of oxygen. I reached for my water, felt the cool against my palm, and listened to the truth arriving like a train you can hear long before you see it. My father waited for the dutiful chorus of cheers. It did not come. He cleared his throat and lifted his glass a fraction higher, as if altitude alone could fix tone. To Heather, he said again, firmer now, and a soft murmur rose my mother, rescuing Brian complying. Heather accepting what had always been hers. I placed my napkin on the table, not a dramatic drop, just a careful fold laid beside my dessert plate. The candles wavered their flames suddenly thin, and in the reflected wicks, I saw my face as if it belonged to a stranger who had grown tired of watching herself be erased. There are moments when your whole life feels like a hallway narrowing to a single door. I could hear the clock in the next room, and the dull hush of tires passing on the avenue, and under all of it, the steady drum of my own pulse telling me I could step through or stand still. My father was still smiling toward Heather, already moving on to advice about partners and the firm's summer retreat. My mother's mouth had set in that familiar line that announces we will not be discussing this. Aunt Vivian kept her eyes on me, the smallest tilt of her head an invitation and a benediction. I looked at Heather, at the diamond light catching in the cut of her ring, at the confidence of a person who has only ever been received, and felt something clean and precise settle into place. Not anger, not even grief, though, both waited nearby, like weather ready to change. It was a boundary quiet as a breath, definite as glass. I lifted my gaze to my father and waited for him to look at me. When he finally did, I saw it land surprise first, then irritation, then something that looked like a man realizing the script has been misplaced. The words I was about to say were simple calm and very expensive. They would cost the version of our family where I agreed to be background. They would buy me a different life. I set my water down so softly the coaster barely noticed. The candles stilled, the hallway narrowed, the door opened, and with a voice as steady as the road that would carry me 55 miles home, I began to speak. My father's glass was still raised when I spoke, the bubbles in the champagne rising between us like a curtain about to fall. What I said was quiet, but every syllable landed with the weight of years. The air changed, first something sharp and electric settling over the table. My mother froze halfway through a nervous smile, while Heather blinked confused that I'd interrupted what was always her moment. The chandelier hummed faintly, a sound I'd never noticed before, like the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't plan the words. They came from somewhere old and tired inside me. Good thing I've got my own place 55 miles away, I said, my voice steady enough to startle even myself. From now on, the rent, the utilities, the insurance, they're all your problem. My father frowned, the expression more puzzled than angry, like he'd misheard a figure in his ledger. What are you talking about, Dana? I met his eyes. I'm talking about no longer taking up space where I'm not wanted. I watched the words land. It wasn't a shout, not even defiance. It was a release. My mother was the first to recover, smoothing her napkin in that brisk managerial way she used whenever emotion entered the room. Don't be so dramatic, she said. Your father was just expressing his pride in Heather. Was he? I asked, and my tone carried something I hadn't used in years: clarity. Because it sounded like he was saying, "I'm worthless, and based on the way you've treated me my whole life, I think that's exactly what he meant." Heather leaned back, arms crossed, her diamond catching the light. "See, this is why no one takes you seriously. Everything turns into a scene." The same words that used to flatten me now rang hollow like a tune I'd outgrown. Only Aunt Vivian broke the rhythm. "Thomas," she said softly, "that was an unkind thing to say." My father waved her off with the impatience of a man unwilling to consider the cost of his own comfort. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it was a joke. Dana knows we love her. She just needs to toughen up." I stood then slowly, as if the movement itself were sacred. 28 years, I said. 28 years of trying to earn the love you give her without question. My napkin lay folded beside my untouched dessert, a small symbol of order in the middle of chaos. I'm done trying to earn a seat at this table. The silence that followed was almost tender in its depth. I could hear the faint tick of the kitchen clock and the soft shift of Aunt Vivian's bracelet as she exhaled. My father's voice rose at last, brittle and loud. "So that's it. You throw a tantrum and storm out." "No," I said. "This isn't a tantrum. It's a boundary." His face tightened at the word. I reached for my purse, the leather cool against my palm. "The support you dangle when it's convenient, that's your problem now. The judgment about my work, the comparisons, the pity, that's all yours. I'm not carrying it anymore." My mother's voice thinned, almost pleading. "Dana, please not tonight. It's Heather's special night. We can talk about this later." "It's always Heather's night," I said gently. "And there's never a right time to talk about how much it hurts." I turned to Heather. "Congratulations on your promotion. I hope it brings you happiness." The room felt smaller as I walked out. No one stopped me. No one even rose. The only sound that followed was the soft click of the door closing behind me. Outside, the night air smelled of rain and cold stone. For a moment, I stood on the front steps, breathing it in like medicine. Then I walked to my car heels, tapping softly against the walkway, a sound that no longer asked for permission. By the time I reached the driver's seat, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the strange freedom that comes after too much silence. The headlights swept across the familiar facade of my parents' house, the white trim gleaming like bone. I thought about all the birthdays, all the dinners where my art was treated like clutter. I thought about Heather's trophies lined on the mantel, polished every spring, and the single watercolor I'd done of our backyard that my mother kept tucked in a closet to avoid dust. As I drove, the dark pressed close around the road, broken only by the rhythmic flash of mile markers. By the 10th mile, my chest ached with the release of something I'd been holding since childhood. By the 15th, tears blurred the asphalt ahead, not from sadness, but from recognition. I was finally doing what I should have done years ago. By the 30th, I started laughing softly, the sound strange and new, realizing how absurd it was that I'd spent my whole life begging for a kind of love my parents didn't know how to give. When I reached my apartment, the familiar red brick building looked different, almost alive. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, the air carrying the scent of paint and coffee from my neighbor's door. Inside, everything felt real, in a way my childhood home never had. My own paintings leaned against the wall, colors alive under the lamplight. The thrifted sofa, the mismatched mugs, the stack of canvases drying in the corner. They were my life, imperfect, but mine. I slipped off my shoes and set my purse on the counter. The quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. I poured a glass of wine, the kind I used to imagine drinking when I had my own place, and sat by the window, overlooking the narrow street below. The city was winding down. The bakery sign across the way flickered off, and a stray cat darted through the puddles left by a brief rain. I lifted the glass and whispered to the dark, "Here's to finally taking up space." My phone buzzed, the screen lighting the room. A text from my mother. Her words were as polished as her table. "Your behavior tonight was unacceptable. You embarrassed us in front of Brian. Call me when you've calmed down." I stared at the message thumb hovering over the screen. Then I pressed Do Not Disturb. Instead, I called Zoe. She answered on the second ring, her voice rough with sleep. "Dana." "It's late. What happened?" "I left," I said. I finally walked out. For a moment, she was quiet. Then came the warmth of her laugh, soft, proud, knowing. "You actually did it." "I did," I whispered. "I don't think I can go back." "Then don't," she said simply. "You drew your line. Let them decide what they'll do with it." Her certainty steadied me. We talked for nearly an hour, long enough for the adrenaline to fade and the exhaustion to settle in. When I hung up, the city was silent again. I closed my eyes and felt the deep, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. It was the first night in years that I slept without rehearsing how to explain myself. Morning light crept through the tall windows, soft and golden. The apartment looked like a painting in progress, unfinished but full of life. I brewed coffee and watched steam rise in slow ribbons. My hands still trembled slightly, but not from regret, from change. I called the gallery and told Elaine I wouldn't make it in that day. My voice sounded calm, almost foreign to my own ears. Then I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and opened a blank email. The cursor blinked, patiently waiting. I began typing, each word deliberate and certain. "Dear Mom and Dad, I want to be clear about what happened last night and what it means for our relationship going forward." The sentences built themselves line by line, steady and measured. I wrote about 28 years of trying to earn their approval, about the endless comparisons, the quiet dismissals. I wrote about changing, not them, but myself. When I finished, I read it twice, adjusted nothing, and pressed send. The relief came not in a rush, but as a slow exhale. My phone buzzed minutes later with another text from my mother, sharp and clipped. I didn't read it. Instead, I opened my sketchbook and began to draw, the pencil gliding easily across the page. For the first time, the lines didn't tremble. That night, I took a walk through the neighborhood, the air cool and clean after sunset. The small art district glowed softly with strings of lights between the buildings. In the windows, people lingered over late dinners, laughter spilling into the street. I realized I'd spent years watching scenes like this from the outside, believing I didn't belong. But now, even without knowing what would come next, I felt the outline of belonging beginning to form around me. When I returned home, I placed my phone face down on the counter and lit a single candle by the window. The flame moved gently in the draft, its reflection trembling in the glass. I thought of my father's toast, those words meant to wound, and smiled at the small luminous truth flickering before me. Some kids make their parents proud, and some learn to make themselves proud instead. I sat there until the candle burned low, the city quiet beyond the window, the air filled with the faint scent of wax and paint. Somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, I understood that leaving that table wasn't the end of my story. It was only the first clean line on a new canvas, one that I would fill slowly, deliberately, and entirely on my own. The candle had burned down to a shallow pool of wax by the time I finally stood and blew it out. The room went quiet, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like space I'd cleared for myself. Morning came pale and clean. Sunlight spilled through the wide windows, warming the brush handles scattered across my desk. I brewed coffee strong and dark and sat at the kitchen table with my sketchbook open, but my hands wouldn't move. They rested there, steady but uncertain, as if waiting for the next step to show itself. By the second cup, I knew what I needed to do. I turned my laptop toward me and opened a new email. I wasn't angry anymore, not even hurt in the same sharp way as before. What I felt was clarity, cold still necessary. I began to type. Each sentence came slow but certain, like walking a narrow bridge I'd built myself. I told them what I hadn't been able to say at that table, that I was done trying to earn what should have been given freely. That I wasn't blaming, only choosing to stop bleeding for their approval. When I finished, I read it once more, fixed nothing, and pressed send. I expected to feel guilty. I didn't. Instead, there was that quiet kind of relief you feel after moving a piece of furniture that's been blocking the doorway for years. The rest of the morning passed in stillness. Outside, a street musician played something soft and wandering. I stood by the window with my coffee and watched the light slide across the brick buildings. My phone buzzed 3 times, my mother, my father, then Heather, but I didn't read a single message. I set the phone face down and went back to my desk. When Zoe called that evening, I could hear the concern in her voice, the careful pause before she spoke. "Did you do it?" she asked. "I did," I said. It wasn't angry. It was just final. She let out a low breath, a sound between a sigh and a smile. "Then you're free, Dana." That's what it sounds like. I wanted to believe her, but freedom is rarely simple. The first few days were quiet, but it wasn't peace yet. Every few hours, I'd check my email, half expecting an apology that never came. My mother's eventual reply arrived late at night, polite and cold as an invoice. "We've always supported you. Maybe consider that your sister just works harder." I didn't respond. The words had no heat anymore. They just lay there hollow. The next morning, I walked to the gallery early. Elaine was unlocking the front door, her red scarf caught in the wind. She turned, saw my face, and nodded as if she already knew. "You did something brave," she said quietly. "Now you'll have to live like it." Inside, the air smelled faintly of turpentine and cedar frames. I hung my coat, slipped into the back studio, and began setting out brushes. The familiar ritual steadied me, the weight of paint, the pull of color across canvas. As I worked, I felt the tangle inside me start to loosen. Each stroke was a declaration I exist. I take up space. A week later, the first real test came. My cousin Allison's wedding invitation arrived in the mail cream paper and gold script. Under different circumstances, I might have gone smiling through another night of polite questions. But now, the decision came easily. I wrote my regrets, enclosed a thoughtful gift, and mailed it back without hesitation. That night, my phone rang my mother again. I didn't answer. Her voicemail came through moments later, thin with disapproval. "People will ask why you aren't there. What are we supposed to tell them?" I didn't reply, but I whispered my answer to the quiet room. "Tell them the truth." The days found a rhythm. I worked at the gallery 3 shifts a week and painted through the evenings. Elaine's kindness made the space feel almost like family, the kind that listens more than it talks. She started calling me our resident artist, half teasing, half sincere. Every time she did, I felt a little steadier on my feet. 2 weeks after that, Aunt Vivian called. I hadn't realized how much I missed her voice until I heard it. Warm, deliberate, always carrying a bit of compassion between the words. "I've been thinking about that dinner," she said. "I wanted to call sooner, but I needed time to sit with it." I waited, listening to the soft hum of her breath on the line. "Your mother learned those habits long before she ever became a parent," she continued. "Our parents, your grandparents, favored her too. I spent my whole life trying to earn what she was given automatically. She never saw it for what it was. She still doesn't." Her words settled deep, not as an excuse, but an understanding. "So, it wasn't me," I said quietly. "It was never you," she replied. "But the difference between us is you stopped the pattern." I didn't. We spoke for nearly 2 hours. She told me stories I'd never heard, how my mother once cried over a single B in high school, how praise had always been currency in their house. By the time we hung up, I felt something inside me ease, a knot of questions beginning to dissolve. The next morning, I opened my sketchbook and began a new series, abstract shapes of intertwined lines, breaking apart, finding balance. I didn't name it at first, but later I wrote the word boundaries in small letters at the bottom of the first page. My world expanded slowly after that. Zoe would stop by with takeout and sit on the floor while I painted, our conversations drifting between laughter and quiet. Sometimes Elaine would join us, her wine glass balanced on her knee, as she talked about the next exhibition. I started noticing how comfortable silence could be when it wasn't full of judgment. It was during one of those evenings that Elaine leaned forward, eyes bright. "Dana, I've been talking with a curator from the Riverside Gallery in the next city. They're hosting a show on emerging regional artists. I mentioned your work." I blinked, unsure whether to believe her. "You did?" "They're interested," she said, smiling. "Send me photos of your latest pieces. I think you're ready." When she left, I stood for a long time in the middle of my apartment, hands still covered in paint. Ready. It was a word I hadn't let myself claim before. That night, I emailed the curator, attaching images of 3 recent works, the ones that felt truest to who I'd become. I didn't tell my family. I didn't need to. Days later, I received a reply, an official invitation to participate in the upcoming exhibition. My breath caught as I read it. They called my work deeply personal and visually resonant. I printed the letter and taped it above my desk, a small flag of proof that art built from pain could grow into something larger. When Zoe came over, she hugged me so tightly that the paper crinkled in her hands. "You see, this is what happens when you stop asking permission to exist." I laughed, but tears blurred the edges of the room. For the first time, I didn't think about whether my parents would approve. I thought about the people who already did, the ones who saw me, who clapped when I wasn't on stage. Weeks passed as I prepared for the show. I stretched new canvases, mixed colors, until they hummed with the right emotion. Elaine helped me photograph the work, and Zoe brought snacks when I forgot to eat. Even Professor Larson, my old mentor, called after seeing a post about the exhibition online. "Proud of you, Dana," he said. "You've found your voice. Guard it." The night before the gallery opening, I sat by the window again. The city outside was soft with spring rain, streets gleaming under the lamplight. I thought of my parents, how quiet their house must be, how carefully everything was still arranged. A small ache stirred, not longing, not regret, something closer to understanding. The next morning, I printed a simple invitation and addressed it to my parents. I wrote only a few lines. "I'll be part of the Emerging Voices exhibition at Riverside Gallery on April 15th. If you'd like to come, you're welcome." Then I sent the email and closed my laptop. I didn't expect a reply, and that made the act feel even stronger. The choice wasn't about them anymore. It was about truth. Whether they came or not, I would be standing in that gallery, surrounded by work that carried my name, my voice, my life. That evening, I returned to my studio and stood before the painting that had started it all, the one I'd made the night I walked away from my parents' table. Under the soft light, I could still see the faint marks of anger beneath the newer layers of calm. The piece had grown like I had imperfect scarred, but whole. I picked up a small brush, signed my name in quiet strokes, and stepped back. The color caught the light just right, a shimmer of gold across the edges. I smiled to myself, realizing the truth that had taken me nearly 3 decades to learn. Sometimes you have to lose a family to find your place in the world. Outside, the rain eased into mist. I opened the window, letting in the scent of wet pavement and lilac from a nearby garden. Somewhere below, a car passed slowly, its tires whispering over the street. I stood there until the last light faded, heart steady, knowing that the next time I saw my family, I would no longer be the daughter waiting to be chosen. I would be the woman who had chosen herself. 2 weeks before the exhibition, an email arrived from my mother. It was brief, 2 sentences at most, thanking me for the invitation and saying they would check their calendars. There was no warmth, no curiosity, not even the usual attempt to smooth things over. I closed my laptop without rereading it. I already knew what silence sounded like in our family. This was just another form of it. Work filled the days that followed. The gallery hummed with late spring air, windows open to the scent of lilac and fresh paint. Elaine and I rearranged walls, tested lighting, measured spacing for each artist's work. In my studio, I moved through the process slowly, one canvas at a time, touching, polishing, breathing with the pieces until they felt ready to be seen. At night, I found myself walking the city's quiet streets, imagining how the opening would feel. Strangers pausing before my art, maybe finding something of themselves inside the colors. That thought steadied me. On the morning of the show, I woke before dawn. Pale light slipped through the blinds, soft against the stacks of canvases waiting by the door. I made coffee, but it went cold before I drank it. My clothes were laid out: a simple black dress, a silver necklace Aunt Vivian had given me for graduation. I took my time getting ready, not out of vanity, but reverence. The years of being overlooked had taught me how sacred it was to finally be seen. By early evening, the Riverside Gallery glowed with movement. The building itself had been a warehouse, once high ceilings, polished concrete floors. Old beams left exposed like scars turned beautiful. Guests filled the space in low waves of conversation, the air carrying the soft scent of wine and varnish. Elaine met me at the entrance, her smile bright and steady. "Your pieces are drawing people already," she whispered, leading me toward the central wall. 3 of my paintings hung together, wide strokes of blue and copper and white, layered in a rhythm I hadn't planned, but had somehow found. I stood quietly watching people study them. A woman with silver hair touched her chest and nodded to herself. A young man leaned close, squinting as if the paint might speak if he listened hard enough. I felt something shift in me, a release slow and sure. For once, I didn't feel like an intruder. Around 7, the room was full. Zoe arrived first, her partner trailing behind with 2 glasses of champagne. She hugged me so tightly I could feel the laughter vibrating in her chest. "You did it," she whispered. Elaine joined us a moment later, introducing me to a curator from Chicago who wanted to discuss future work. My heart raced, not from nerves, but from gratitude, the kind that comes when life finally begins to return what you've quietly earned. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing just inside the entrance. My father. Alone. He looked smaller than I remembered, his posture less certain. The suit he wore was formal, but slightly dated, as if he hadn't bought anything new in years. For a moment, I couldn't move. Part of me wanted to look away, pretend he wasn't there, but something steadier inside refused. I walked toward him slowly, heels soft against the concrete. When he saw me, he gave a small, awkward nod. "Your mother couldn't come," he said first. "Board meeting." The way he said it, almost rehearsed, told me he'd needed an excuse more than an explanation. "Thank you for coming," I said. My voice sounded calm, even kind. "Would you like to see my work?" He nodded, and I led him through the crowd toward the central display. I expected him to say something perfunctory to comment on the colors or the price tags, but he didn't. He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, staring longer than I'd ever seen him look at anything I'd made. After a long pause, he said quietly, "I don't understand art. Never have. But this?" His voice trailed off. He gestured toward the canvas, his expression unreadable. "This has something, a power to it." I didn't answer. There was nothing to fix or fill. For once, the silence between us felt honest. The gallery owner passed by then, offering a quick introduction, and when he told my father that 2 of my pieces had already sold, I saw my father straighten slightly, that old instinctive pride rising in him. But it was different this time, not ownership, just recognition. When the owner moved on, my father turned back to me. "Your mother and I got your email," he said. "The one you sent after that dinner." He hesitated. "What I said that night, it was unfair." The words came haltingly, rough at the edges, but real. I watched him search for something more, but that was as far as he could go. And somehow, it was enough. "Yes," I said softly. "It was." He nodded, eyes still on the painting. "You've done well for yourself." "I didn't think you would." A small smile tugged at my lips. "I know." He exhaled, not quite a laugh, not quite regret. "Your sister's getting married in August," he said. "She'd want you to come." Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, it no longer felt like a test I had to pass. "I'll think about it," I said. Before I could say more, Zoe appeared at my side, introducing herself politely, but with a protective edge. "Dana, the local paper wants to speak with you," she said, glancing toward my father, her meaning clear. He caught the cue. "I should be going," he murmured, but as he turned to leave, he paused. "You look like you belong here, Dana." The words reached me differently than I expected. They didn't erase the years of silence or the ache of what had been missing. But they carried a quiet truth, a recognition, small but solid. I watched him walk away through the glass doors, his figure folding into the city lights outside. The rest of the evening moved in a blur of laughter, questions, and flashes of camera light. Strangers told me what my art made them feel. Elaine raised her glass. Zoe stayed until the last guest left, then helped me gather the unsold pieces, her hands gentle with each frame. When we finally stepped out into the cool night air, the street smelled faintly of rain and jasmine. "Are you okay?" she asked. I thought about my father's words about the years I'd spent craving that single acknowledgement. "Yes," I said. "Better than okay." Back home, I set the exhibition roses on the windowsill and sat cross-legged on the floor. The night was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock. I thought about what had changed and what hadn't. My father hadn't apologized for everything, and my mother hadn't come at all. But something inside me had shifted. A kind of gravity I hadn't known I carried had finally released. The next morning, sunlight poured into the studio. The canvases leaned against the wall like sleeping animals after a long journey. I made breakfast and ate slowly, letting the stillness settle around me. Later that day, an email arrived from the gallery. 3 new inquiries, one from a collector in Seattle. My father's words echoed in my mind. "You look like you belong here." Belonging, I realized, wasn't something given. It was something built one quiet choice at a time. That afternoon, I walked down to the river that cut through the city. The path smelled of wet grass and new beginnings. A breeze lifted strands of my hair, carrying the faint scent of paint from my hands. Across the water, sunlight danced on the ripples, breaking and reforming without ever losing its light. I sat on a bench and watched until the day began to fold into gold. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a calm anticipation, the sense that the story between my family and me wasn't finished yet, but no longer defined me either. When I stood to leave, the river had grown still, mirroring the open sky. I walked home slowly, ready for whatever came next, knowing I'd already done the hardest part, learning to stand in the space I'd once been told I didn't deserve. The river still carried the memory of sunlight when I woke the next morning. The air had that soft, hollow calm that only comes after rain, the kind that makes the world feel newly washed. I opened the window, and the scent of damp earth drifted in sweet and clean. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to brace myself for the day. It was just life, simple and unhurried, waiting to be lived. A week passed like that, quiet, full of small routines. Mornings began with coffee and a walk to the river. Evenings ended with the low hum of music from the cafe across the street. Elaine and I met to discuss future shows, and I agreed to teach a weekend workshop for beginners at the Community Arts Center. It wasn't fame or grandeur, but it was purpose. My hands stayed busy. My heart stayed calm. Then one Thursday afternoon, as spring leaned toward summer, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. My sister's voice came through, hesitant and thinner than I remembered. "Hey," she said. "Dad gave me your number. I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." I sat down at the edge of my studio table, the phone warm against my ear. "I'm here," I said quietly. "I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice unsteady, "for inviting them to your show. Dad talked about it for days. He said it was beautiful." She paused. "I looked it up online. The photos were incredible, Dana. I didn't realize how talented you are. The words weren't dramatic or rehearsed. They were plain, sincere, a bridge being built one cautious plank at a time." "Thank you," I said. "I'm sorry," she added, the silence after her words trembling like glass. "For how things used to be, for how I treated you." I let the quiet stretch between us. It wasn't the kind of apology that fixes everything. It was the kind that acknowledges the wreckage and leaves the rest to time. "We both grew up in the same house," I said softly. "It took me a long time to understand how much of that shaped us." Her breath came out uneven. "Maybe we can start over." "Maybe we can," I said, but slowly. She seemed relieved by that word. We spoke a little longer about her wedding plans, about how she'd been seeing a therapist who helped her untangle some of the same things I'd carried. When the call ended, I sat for a while, staring at the unfinished canvas before me. It felt different from any closure I'd imagined, not triumph or vindication, just a steady quiet. Healing, I realized, wasn't loud. It was the gentle sound of something finally mending. That weekend, I drove to Aunt Vivian's house in Ridgefield. The lilacs were blooming along her fence, and the air buzzed with bees and sunlight. She hugged me at the door and didn't let go for a long moment. "You look lighter," she said, studying my face. "I feel lighter," I replied. We spent the afternoon in her garden, drinking lemonade and talking about ordinary things: her neighbor's new puppy, the stubborn patch of weeds she refused to surrender. Eventually, she turned to me with that thoughtful look she always had. "You did the hardest thing a person can do," she said. "You stopped needing them to change before you could heal." I smiled. "Maybe I just got tired." "No," she said gently. "You got wise." As the sun lowered, I helped her carry the last of the garden clippings to the compost pile. Fireflies began to blink near the porch, soft and brief. I thought about the years I'd spent chasing love that was conditional, about how long it took to understand that peace isn't granted, it's claimed. When I returned home that night, I found an envelope tucked under my apartment door. My name was written in my father's tidy, measured handwriting. Inside was a note no longer than a paragraph. "I'm proud of what you've built. I don't say things like that easily. Your mother and I are trying to understand what we missed. Maybe one day you'll let us visit your studio." I read it twice. Then I placed it in the top drawer of my desk next to the letter from the curator who had first believed in my work. Both were milestones, different kinds of recognition, the external and the deeply personal. The following month passed in a rhythm that felt right. I taught the art class at the community center, and the room filled with the smell of paint and laughter. One of the students, a shy older man named Leonard, painted sunsets over and over, each one a little brighter than the last. Watching him reminded me of myself years ago, quietly reaching for light without knowing what it meant. Sometimes after class, I'd linger by the riverbank. The same water that once reflected my uncertainty now mirrored calm skies. I'd think about my family not with bitterness, but with distance. Boundaries had turned from walls into soft edges, porous enough for compassion, firm enough for peace. Late one evening, my mother called. Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its old sharpness. "Your father showed me your letter," she said. "I wasn't ready to read it before. I am now." I said nothing, letting her continue. "You were right," she whispered. "We made love into a ledger. I don't know how to undo that, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." For a long moment, all I heard was the hum of her breath, the faint rustle of paper somewhere behind her. My throat tightened, but my voice stayed steady. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "That's enough for now." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was understanding. A doorway cracked open after years of silence. When we hung up, I stepped out onto the balcony. The night was warm, the city quiet, except for the distant rumble of a train. Somewhere inside me, something settled into place. A few weeks later, my gallery pieces traveled to a regional exhibition in Boston. Elaine and Zoe came along, filling the trip with laughter and long conversations. During the closing night, a journalist asked how I'd describe my journey as an artist. I thought for a moment, fingers tracing the rim of my glass. "It started with silence," I said. "And it's ending with peace." The drive home was long, but the landscape rolled by like a memory, fields, rivers, and the slow fade of daylight over distant hills. When I reached my apartment, the air was cool and fragrant with night-blooming jasmine. I unlocked the door, set down my bag, and stood by the window. Across the street, someone's wind chimes stirred in the breeze, soft and uneven. On my desk, the letter from my father still lay in the drawer. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The meaning had already found its way into my days, in the laughter of my students, in the quiet of my mornings, in the steadiness of my own reflection. As dusk deepened, I lit a single candle. Its light flickered against the wall, the same wall that once held the first painting I ever made. I sat down with my sketchbook, the paper warm beneath my hands. Outside, the city moved gently alive, but unhurried. Some stories don't end with a grand reconciliation. Sometimes they end with a simple truth, the understanding that peace doesn't require permission. It grows in the space where noise used to live. I closed the sketchbook and smiled to myself, the candle still dancing in the corner of my eye. Life felt quiet, ordinary, and good. If this story touched something in you, tell me where you're listening from. And if you've ever learned to make peace with your own silence, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, healing, and second chances. Until next time, thank you for listening and take care of your peace.